y'all can take a look at it again if you want to. Any questions just before we get going? We're going to try to wrap this up and finish up chapter 14 today. All right. We are, let me get my PowerPoint pulled up here. There we go. All right, so we are going to finish up chapter 14, and this will wrap up our material for the next test coming up. Reminder, we will do a review next week on Tuesday, so make sure you bring questions, that you may have for me to discuss, or topics or whatever. And then that way we have something we can do a good review off of. Y'all have done a pretty good job of that for the first two reviews, so keep up whatever you've been doing to get me questions for the exam. Exam will be next Thursday. Make sure you have a Scantron and plenty enough time. That way you're not running around looking for it on Thursday morning. And then I won't see you again until the final exam. So we're running out of days here, and we're getting really close. So just hang in there, keep pushing, keep studying hard, and you'll be there soon enough. All right. So last class we left off. We were just starting to get into talking about the brain. We were talking about how quickly the brain grows in neonatal development and in the first few years or the first few months after birth. Today, we're going to kind of start talking about the individual parts of the brain. There are four basic regions of the brain itself. We have the brain stem, we have the cerebellum, we have the diencephalon, and we have the cerebrum. We're going to talk about all of these individually, but in just a few minutes. But let's spend just a couple of minutes here talking about them as what each one is kind of made up of. The brainstem is going to be the most inferior part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that's going to actually connect to the spinal cord, and it's going to consist of three different structures: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. The cerebellum is going to be the second largest part of the brain. It's going to be located kind of posterior to the brainstem. When we look at a diagram, you'll kind of see the relationship of the brainstem to the cerebellum. It kind of sits in the back here, kind of tucked under the cerebrum and behind the brainstem. But the cerebellum is going to be a really important part of the brain because it's kind of our unconscious part of our brain. I mean, a lot of our brain is unconscious that we're not actually, using to control thought, but it handles a huge portion of things that we maintain on a daily basis to help us with the maintenance of homeostasis. The diencephalon is kind of the oldest part of the brain from an evolutionary standpoint anyway. And it is going to be made up of different regions: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and another smaller region called the epithalamus. And then you have the cerebrum, which is the biggest, newest part of our brain. When I say newest part of our brain, what I'm talking about is kind of from an evolutionary standpoint. All right. That's what we mean when we say newest part. That's the part of the brain that truly, like I said last class, separates us out from the rest of the animal species or rest of the animal kingdom, because it allows us as humans to do things that other species don't have the capability of doing. So here's a good mid-sagittal section diagram of the brain itself, similar to kind of what you'll see in lab. This just kind of gives you an idea as to where all these different parts are. You got your cerebellum out here, you got your cerebrum back here, brainstem here, and the diencephalon is going to be this general area right here. And you can see the different parts that make up each one of those different regions. This little chart here, or table, breaks down kind of the main functions of those different parts of the brain, or main characteristics. So this will be a good little study table for you to use. So maybe make a note of this study table so you can come back to it and help you summarize kind of what these different parts of the brain do. The brain itself obviously doesn't make up a huge portion of our body mass, but because of the amount of ATP that gets used by the nervous system, the brain is going to take up a huge portion of our nutrient intake. All right. So how much oxygen we take in, and how much glucose gets used, how much fuel is dedicated to the nervous system. A huge part of it, 20%, is going to be dedicated just to the brain tissue alone. Now, a major reason for that is because of the huge amount of gray matter or unmyelinated tissue that we do have in the brain. But I want you to think about that for just a second, that 2% or somewhere between 1 to 2% of your body mass is going to use 20% of the resources that we're bringing in on a daily basis. That means that the brain has to be very vascular. It has to be very well supplied so we can deliver those nutrients. And any slight reduction in the amount of blood that we're providing to the brain is going to have a dramatic effect on the amount of ATP that the brain can synthesize. And if we don't have enough ATP for the brain to synthesize, then the brain can't work optimally, which is then going to negatively affect all of the other systems, kind of in a trickle down pattern. If we don't have control, then everything that runs off of the brain, which is all of the other 11 organ systems, then we're going to basically have things that are essentially out of control. Now, how do we get blood to the brain? We're going to have 4 major blood vessels, which are going to be bringing blood to the brain. 2 internal carotid arteries, and then 2 vertebral arteries. The internal carotid arteries are going to pass through the carotid foramen. So if you remember the carotid foramens from lab, those little openings that you had in the skull that were just anterior to the jugular foramen, that's where the internal carotid arteries are going to pass. We do have external carotid arteries, but they feed into the external surface of the cranium and the face. The vertebral arteries are actually the purpose for our transverse foramen that we find in all of our cervical vertebrae. If you were in my lab class, we talked about the differences between cervical vertebra and thoracic and lumbar vertebra. And we said one of the major differences was these extra foramen in the transverse processes. The transverse foramen exists to allow for these blood vessels to pass through. Essentially what we have is a very, very safe way of delivering blood. If we only had one blood vessel to deliver blood to the brain, and we had some type of blockage to that blood vessel, then that would mean we would have no way to get blood to the brain. So rather than having one, we have more than one. And what's better than 2? Well, 4. So we have 4 separate vessels that are all bringing blood to the brain that are actually all interconnected. You can kind of see on this diagram, this little circle in here. That circle is called the circle of Willis. And that circle is going to interconnect all 4 arteries that are bringing blood to the brain. So that if we have one artery blocked, there's still 3 arteries bringing blood to the brain that are all interconnected to make sure that the brain gets a complete blood supply, instead of just having one artery going to the front right and one artery going to the front left and one artery going to the back right and one artery going to the back left. Then if we had blockage to the back left artery, then the back left part of the brain wouldn't receive any blood. But because of this circle of Willis, which when you get into A&P2, you'll talk about the circle of Willis. Because of that circle of Willis, it allows for, it's kind of a built-in safety mechanism to make sure that the brain is constantly receiving blood if there's blockage or damage to one of those arteries. Now, we mentioned the blood-brain barrier when we were talking in chapter 12. We know that the astrocytes are going to play a very important role in creation of this blood-brain barrier. And we talked about the ability for the body to control then what gets out of the bloodstream. We said that was an important factor because obviously we have pathogens and things in the blood that we don't want to have access to the nervous tissue because the nervous tissue is so delicate. But it also presents a problem because some other things need to be actively transported into the brain. They can't just easily move from the blood into the brain. And so what that means is that it is going to require us to use ATP to get some of these things in. Other things like antibiotics are going to have a harder time, if at all, being able to cross the blood-brain barrier, which is why we said with a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture that we do in cases where we might have a meningitis situation, we might need to treat that patient by injecting the antibiotics directly into the subarachnoid space, because those antibiotics, if taken orally or intravenously, wouldn't be able to cross the blood-brain barrier in order to get into the nervous tissue, in order to help to heal the infection in the nervous tissue. The blood-brain barrier is something that pharmaceutical companies have been able to utilize to help them manipulate how certain drugs interact with the brain. Um, for example, antihistamine drugs like Sudafed or NyQuil or things like that. A lot of those antihistamine drugs used to all make you tired. Okay, for example, I mean NyQuil knocks you out, puts you to sleep. I mean that's part of one of its selling points, is to help you sleep when you don't feel good. But then, not long after they had NyQuil, they came out with DayQuil, which was the same version of medication, except that you could take it during the day because it didn't make you tired. What was it that they changed about the formula of NyQuil to DayQuil? They basically just made the molecular structure bigger. By making the molecular structure bigger and making it not change the way that the medication behaved, it prevented it from crossing over the blood-brain barrier and having its sedative effects on the brain. They used to have a pill form of antihistamine called Actifed. Actifed is, I don't think, around anymore, but basically it was Sudafed that made you sleepy. And Sudafed developed from Actifed in a way that you could take it during the day and it wouldn't make you tired. But again, that's how pharmaceutical companies can start to understand how the nervous system works, which helps them to manipulate then the way they produce and make their medications. Now, cerebral spinal fluid, we mentioned, was going to be found in the subarachnoid space. And we also said that in the spinal cord, we found it in the central canal. Cerebral spinal fluid is also going to be found in the subarachnoid space around the brain, but it's also going to be found deep in what we call ventricles, located at the internal cavities deep within the inside of the brain. These ventricles have two lateral ventricles. They're going to be on either side of a structure called the septum pellucidum, that are deep in the diencephalon. We then have a third ventricle, which is going to be around the thalamus region, which is also in the diencephalon region. And then we're going to have a fourth ventricle, which is going to be located just anterior to the cerebellum, kind of between the pons, which is part of our brainstem, and the cerebellum. And the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle are going to be connected by a little tube called the cerebral aqueduct. One of the purposes of cerebral spinal fluid is to help provide a little extra protection to the brain and the spinal cord. Because the brain and the spinal cord kind of floats in this fluid, as we get jostled around and banged around over the course of a day or our lifetime, the spinal cord and the brain is going to kind of move more slowly within the dorsal cavity because of the fluid surrounding it. Much in the same way, like if you had a glass jar and you filled it up with rocks and you didn't put anything in the jar, you could shake the jar and the rocks would likely break the glass. But if you filled the jar up with water and you shook the jar, the rocks would move more slowly in the water-filled jar and they wouldn't hit against the glass as hard, and you're less likely then to break the jar. So it's the same kind of concept with the cerebral spinal fluid, giving protection to the brain and the spinal cord. But the cerebral spinal fluid also is going to help to transport nutrients and get rid of waste material between the blood and the nervous tissue. So it kind of serves as a twofold. All right, so let's talk about structures within the brain. The first thing we're going to talk about is the brainstem. And the brainstem is a very important part of the brain because it is kind of the entry point and the exit point for the brain. Again, we said it is made up of three different regions. We've got the medulla oblongata, we've got the pons, and we've got the midbrain. And we're going to talk about all three of these parts individually, starting with the medulla oblongata. Now, the medulla oblongata is the inferior most part of the brainstem, and it's going to be the only part of the brainstem that actually extends outside of the cranial cavity. Remember, the foramen magnum, the opening in the base of the skull, allows for the brainstem to extend out, which is why we said the spinal cord didn't start until about the level of C2. The brainstem that extends out is this little section right here. Now, the medulla oblongata is a really important part of the brainstem because this is truly the gateway in and out of the brain. I mean, the spinal cord connects to the brain right here at the medulla oblongata, which means any sensory information coming from the body has to come up and pass through the medulla oblongata, and any motor information leaving the brain has to exit again through the medulla oblongata. So we want to make sure the medulla oblongata is very well protected and that it stays fully intact. Now, another thing about the medulla oblongata is that it is going to contain some of our sensory or some of our autonomic function ganglia, which are related to respiratory control and cardiovascular control. From a cardiovascular standpoint, the medulla oblongata is going to have ganglia that are going to be used to help to monitor and maintain things like heart rate or blood pressure. It doesn't actually tell the heart to beat. The brain and the heart are disconnected in that regards. Okay. In fact, the heart is under its own control. All right. The brain does not actually control the heart, which is why we see patients that have suffered and sustained traumatic brain injuries. We can see them still live on life support for years or sometimes decades. Because as long as you give the heart oxygen and nutrients, the heart can continue to run even without brain activity. When a person is on quote unquote life support, what that life support is doing for them is it's breathing for them. As long as they have nutrients via feeding tube and they have respiration, which is providing them oxygen, then the tissues of the body can stay alive, including the heart. All right. Because again, the heart is not running based on brain function. However, respiration is controlled by the ganglia within the medulla oblongata, and when we have damage to those nuclei or those ganglia, we are going to see respiration shut down. Which is why an injury to the medulla oblongata, like a fracture at the base of the skull, oftentimes results in death because of severing the medulla oblongata, damaging the centers of respiratory control, which then lead to asphyxiation, which is also why those patients are on a ventilator, okay, because that ventilator is breathing for them since they can't breathe for themselves. We mentioned the descending tracts, which are carrying motor information away from the brain. Those descending tracts are going to cross over in the medulla oblongata. This crossing over of the descending tracts or the motor tracts is called the desiccation of the pyramids. And this is the reason why the left side of our brain controls motor function on the right side of our body, and the right side of our brain controls motor function on the left side of our body, which is why we say oftentimes people that are right-handed are left-brained and people that are left-handed are right-brained, because that motor function is originating on the side opposite that you have as a dominant side. So if you're right-handed and you're right-handed, that signal's originating on the left side of your brain, and vice versa with left-handed people. We talked about centers for cardiovascular and respiratory control. The medulla oblongata is also going to have centers located there that are going to initiate some of our reflexes like vomiting, coughing, and sneezing, which are all protective reflexes for the digestive and the respiratory system. We're also going to have 5 of our 12 cranial nerves begin in the medulla oblongata. So you can see that this area of the brainstem, even though it extends outside the cranial cavity, is a really, really important part of brain function. The pons is going to lie just superior to the medulla oblongata, and the pons essentially connects the cerebral part of the brain to the cerebellum part of the brain. It also is a pathway in which our ascending and descending tracts are going to move in and out of the brain. These 2 regions, the cerebrum, cerebellum, 2 largest parts of the brain, and they are the 2 most controlling parts of the brain. The diencephalon has some controlling functions, but a lot of what it does is in the interpretation part. The brainstem is kind of a passageway. It's mostly made up of white matter. So it's not going to be used for a lot of thinking, but we're just transmitting information through the brainstem. But these two parts are going to be the active, quote unquote, thinking parts of the brain. So we have to have a means of communicating between our conscious part of the brain and our unconscious part of the brain. And a lot of that is going to be done here through the pons. Superior to the pons is an area of the brain called the midbrain. The midbrain has an anterior and a posterior portion to it. The anterior portion, located right here, is going to contain our descending motor tracts. All right, we call those the cerebral peduncles. Then posteriorly back here, we're going to have two structures on both the left and right side that we call colliculi. We have a superior colliculus and an inferior colliculus. Now, the anterior and posterior parts of the midbrain are going to be separated by that tube that we talked about that's called the cerebral aqueduct, right? You can kind of see it right there where I'm pointing the arrow to. And that's going to connect the third ventricle, which is going to be in this general area right here. Up here would be one of our lateral ventricles. Right here would be the third ventricle. And then down here, just in front of the cerebellum, would be our fourth ventricle. So cerebral spinal fluid is going to get produced in these ventricles, and it's going to flow through those ventricles and eventually end up in the central canal of the spinal cord. But the connection between the third and fourth ventricle is through this cerebral aqueduct, which runs right there. And again, that's going to separate the posterior and anterior portions of the midbrain. The cerebellum is, like we said, the second largest part of the brain, and it is going to contain a huge number of the 100 billion neurons that we have in the brain itself. The cerebellum is, like I said, basically helping to control the unconscious thought or unconscious control that we have over, say, skeletal muscle contractions. When we want to contract skeletal muscles, that thought is going to originate from the cerebrum. But when our body or when our brain contracts skeletal muscles for us, like they do with postural muscles, that is going to come from the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is going to play a huge role in things like our ability to coordinate complex motor movements, right? If we, for example, walking is a hugely complex process, which requires changes in center of gravity, shifting your body weight, swinging your right arm forward as your left leg goes forward, and then your left arm forward as your right leg goes forward, and transference of weight to the ball of your foot and the heel of your foot. There's a lot of information that's gathered from proprioceptors in the joints that has to be interpreted in the brain, that then has to be translated back to all of the musculature. And that's part of what the cerebellum helps us to do. The cerebrum tells us to walk and it tells the muscles to contract. The cerebellum helps that to all run more smoothly. The cerebellum gets separated from the cerebrum by this deep fold right here, which we should call the transverse fissure. The dura mater is actually going to fold into that transverse fissure, which is called the tentorium cerebelli. It kind of helps to compartmentalize different parts of the brain. But the cerebellum is going to be one of the parts of the brain that is most heavily affected. One of the parts of the brain which is the most heavily affected by alcohol. When we drink alcohol, alcohol is obviously a depressant, so it's going to slow down nerve function. As it slows down nerve function in the cerebellum, that then negatively affects things like our posture and our equilibrium and our balance, which means that when you drink, when you take in any amounts of alcohol, those things are going to be negatively affected, which we maybe have experienced at some point in your life. Okay, when you know you've had a couple of extra drinks too many and you get a little unsteady on your feet, or you find yourself slouching down and your posture gets bad. All of that is because that cerebellum is being heavily depressed because it's so negatively influenced by the alcohol that we take in. The two cerebellar hemispheres are going to be connected together by a structure right here called the vermis. And the cerebellum is going to contain a huge amount of white matter, which is going to connect the left and right hemispheres of the cerebellum. If we look at a cross section of the cerebellum right here, You can't see it really great on this, but on the diagram that we looked at earlier, you can see kind of all of the white matter branching out within that cerebellum. And it kind of makes the cerebellum on a cross section look like a tree. So the white matter part of the cerebellum we call the arbor vitae, okay, like tree of life. The gray matter surrounding the tree, okay, the white matter, we call the folia, like the foliage on a tree. So, if you see it on a diagram or when you look at it in lab on the model, if you kind of turn the brain a little bit so that the fourth ventricle is kind of at the bottom, you'll see that tree-like appearance that I was talking about. All right. The diencephalon. We mentioned just a little bit ago that we said the diencephalon is kind of the oldest part of our brain. And when we say oldest, we just mean from an evolutionary standpoint. If you were to compare our diencephalon with the diencephalon of, say, a shark or an alligator or some type of animal species that's been around for millions upon millions of years, where humans have not been around for millions of years, our diencephalon would not be very different than the diencephalon that we see in some of those animals. Our diencephalon would not be very different than your dog's diencephalon or your cat's diencephalon, because the diencephalon's functions are all going to be very, very rudimentary. Okay, they're survival driven. They're functions that every living animal has in order to survive on a daily basis, and it's kind of the things that make us the animals that we are. Okay, so think about instinctive things, and there's a good chance that a lot of that is going to come from the thalamus region. The three parts of the thalamus, like we mentioned, are the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. The diencephalon is going to be the area where we find the third ventricle. Again, third ventricle kind of sits in this region here, around the thalamus and epithalamus and hypothalamus. And these three structures within the diencephalon are all going to have very important functions. The thalamus. This essentially is a relay station for all sensory impulses that are going to be delivered to the cerebral cortex, okay, with the exception of smell, which is going to be delivered to the hypothalamus via cranial nerve 1 because of its location. But every other sensory bit of information is all going to be transmitted to the thalamus and then be routed out to the proper parts of the brain. So think of the thalamus kind of as an Amazon distribution hub. Okay. When you order stuff that isn't, contained at that distribution hub, in the warehouse, they deliver it to the hub and then it gets put on a truck or a van and then it gets sent to your house. When you order it, it just doesn't come from the manufacturer to you. All right. That's kind of the way the thalamus works. When you feel something in your foot, that signal is going to travel up the spinal cord and it's going to the thalamus. When you feel something in your hand, it's going to travel to the thalamus. When you feel something on the side of your face, that sensation is going to travel to the thalamus. It's then going to be routed out to the part of the cerebrum, which is going to interpret the information specific for that part of the body. So it's a really important part of the body because all of our sensory information is going to pass through here. Now, the thalamus also has structures associated with it, which are going to relate memories and emotions related to those memories. Okay, we call it the limbic part of the brain. So again, something that is a very old, as we're talking about evolution, a very old part of our development was the ability for us as humans to have emotions related to memories that we would think of. Or so when you hear something and it reminds you of something and it makes you happy or sad, that's going to all be originated within the thalamic region of the brain. The epithalamus is going to be located posterior to the thalamus. So here we have our thalamus, okay, right there. And the thalamus actually extends out laterally into the cerebral hemisphere. So it's not just this little egg structure that sits in the middle. It kind of sits out as two bulbs. If you look at it on a model in lab, it kind of looks like buns sitting on this, hair buns sitting on the side of somebody's head, as to what the thalamus actually looks like. But just posterior to that is going to be the epithalamus, which is going to contain a gland, okay, the pineal gland, which is responsible for the secretion of melatonin. Now we associate obviously melatonin with our ability to sleep, and that's what melatonin does. We're going to see increased levels of melatonin produced when our photoreceptors in our eye indicate that there are increased levels of darkness. So as it starts to get dark outside and the sun starts to go down, our body is going to slowly start to ramp up our production of melatonin from the pineal gland. As it starts to get light in the morning, our body is going to slowly start to ramp down the secretion of melatonin from the pineal gland. And what that means is that we are designed as living things to go to sleep when it gets dark and wake up when it gets light. Okay. And, before there were cell phones and alarm clocks and all that kind of stuff, that's how the world ran, right? I mean, you woke up when the sun came up and you went to bed shortly after it got dark at night. And as the seasons changed, your sleep patterns changed, and when you were awake changed because you didn't stay up at night because there was nothing to quote unquote do. So that's how all living things are designed to do. And if you've ever worked a night job, you know how hard it is to kind of trick that cycle at first. Your body is struggling there at first because you want to fall asleep, okay, when it starts to get dark outside. Now, what helps us stay awake longer than we normally would because of when it gets dark outside? Artificial light. Artificial light can also have an effect on melatonin production, which is why a lot of times they say, that once it gets dark outside and you want to go to bed, you should start limiting your screen time. Stop sitting in front of the computer, stop playing on your phone, stop playing on your iPad, turn the TV off, because all of that artificial light is continuing to mess with our melatonin levels, which is going to keep us awake for a longer period of time. Um, I know a lot of people that like to sleep with their TV on, and they say, "Oh, well, I sleep better with my TV on." Well, you may fall asleep easier. Maybe it's distracting your brain and helping you fall asleep, but you're not sleeping better while you're sleeping because the flickering light from the TV, okay, that you can see that through your eyelids a little bit. It's flickering and it's affecting your melatonin levels just enough to not let them get high enough to let you fall into that deep sleep or that REM sleep, which is going to give you the best sleep that you can get. So you may be sleeping through the night. You may say, "Oh, I sleep 6, 7 hours," but you may not feel rested in the morning because you didn't fall into that deep sleep because your TV was messing with your REM cycles because of melatonin levels. Now, obviously, you can go to Walgreens or CVS and go buy you some melatonin, but I urge you to be cautious about taking that for extended periods of time because hopefully by now you understand the whole concept of use it or lose it and that our body only makes what it needs. If you're taking melatonin at high enough doses for a long enough period of time without taking any time off, what would that naturally do to your melatonin levels that you secrete? That's going to make them go down, right? I mean, because why would your body continue to make melatonin at the level that it is if you're artificially taking melatonin? Your body's going to say, "Hey, we don't need to make this melatonin. We already have enough that it's being given to us every day." So you can have a negative effect on your own melatonin levels if you take it artificially, which, I think that as you get out into, whatever it is that you're going to do and taking care of patients, I think that that's an important part of helping to educate patients because people think that just because you can go to the drugstore and buy something over the counter that it's perfectly safe. Well, this obviously must have no adverse effects on me because I don't need a prescription for it. Well, that's not the way it works. There's a lot of stuff that you can take over the counter that can have negative effects on you. You can take too much vitamin D, you can take too much vitamin C, you can take too much melatonin. If you take ibuprofen every day, it can cause kidney damage. So just because something's over the counter doesn't mean, hey, it's okay and it's good to take every single day. And so, just make sure that you are, aware of, what the possibilities could be for all of these quote unquote supplements that people think are perfectly fine, and make sure then that you can educate your patients because a lot of people take stuff because they heard from somebody or they read on Facebook or they saw it on the news or whatever. they don't take it necessarily because they need it. They take it because somebody else they know is taking it. You know, oh, why do you take melatonin? Oh, because my cousins, brothers, sisters, uncles, grandma's boyfriend takes melatonin and it helps him sleep. Well, maybe he's melatonin deficient. Maybe that's why he takes melatonin. Okay, maybe you don't need to take it on an everyday basis because you're not deficient in it. All right. I mean, if I took insulin on an everyday basis, my pancreas would stop making insulin. Okay, but there are people that need to take insulin because their body doesn't produce enough insulin. So it's the same kind of thing. But like I said, a lot of people just take advantage of it because it's over the counter and they think it's perfectly safe. The hypothalamus is going to be located a little bit anterior and inferior to the thalamus. It plays a really important role in control of the autonomic nervous system. And it's a bridge of communication between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Remember, our nervous system is our primary means of controlling and coordinating cellular function and bodily function, but we use the endocrine system as well with the release of hormones and the circulation of the blood through the bloodstream. But this bridge of communication has to occur because ultimately the nervous system is still controlling the endocrine system. Body temperature, okay, is going to be maintained and measured in this hypothalamus. So this little portion right here that we see, that is basically your body's thermostat. What the temperature is located in the hypothalamus is going to drive how the rest of your body takes care of itself. Why is our thermostat located there? Well, because our brain is our body's most important organ. We want to make sure the brain is at the perfect body temperature. We want to make sure all of our other organs are at the perfect body temperature as well, too. But if the brain isn't, then the brain is going to malfunction. Why is it going to malfunction? Well, the brain relies heavily on neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are typically proteins. Those proteins are going to denature and they're not going to behave properly if our body temperature fluctuates too much, because we know if we increase body temperature too much, we can denature proteins, which means those neurotransmitters can get denatured, which means brain and neurological function can suffer. Which is why when we see elevated body temperature for extended periods of time, one of the very first things that we start to notice is things like confusion. Patients having an inability to have a clear train of thought, because again, the brain's not working well because of denaturing neurotransmitters. All right, our cerebral cortex, the biggest, the most evolved part of our brain, it's going to be divided into 4 different lobes. And it's going to be mapped out very specifically in these lobes what those parts of the brain are actually controlling. Yes, this is the part of the brain that gives us the ability to do things that other animal species can do, like read and write and speak and have reasoning and have, the initiative and drive to do things. I've got one of my dogs and she's running around right now in and out of the house, acting like a crazy person, playing with one of her toys. She doesn't have a plan for the day. That's just what she does, when the mood strikes her. Because she doesn't have the developed part of her brain like we have to be able to plan out her day. She also doesn't have the ability to reason. If I go get the toy from her and I throw it, she's going to go grab it and she's going to bring it back to me and she's going to go get it again, no matter how many times I throw it. And so, those are things that are lacking within other animal species because they don't have the development of this part of the brain. All the other parts of the brain that we've talked about, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, they're all going to be very similar across animal species because of the actions that are conveyed by those parts of the brain. But the cerebellum, this is where we start to see some real differences. Now, cerebellum, we said, or the cerebrum, we said, is going to be made up of 4 different lobes, 4 primary lobes. The lobes are going to be identified and named for the bones under which they sit. So we're going to have a frontal lobe that sits underneath the frontal bone. We'll have parietal lobes that sit underneath the parietal bone. We'll have occipital lobes that sit underneath the occipital bone. And on the lateral sides, we'll have temporal lobes. These lobes are very specific to the jobs that they are monitoring as far as our brain function is concerned. Vision is going to be interpreted in the occipital lobe. Speech is primarily going to come from the frontal lobe. Hearing is going to be primarily in the temporal lobe. Our smell and taste primarily, parietal lobe. So, you can see how these things all get mapped out. And they didn't always know this. For a long time, they thought that the brain was just this massive neurons that just, controlled everything, but that there was no different from front to back and left to right and side to side and all that kind of stuff. And then along came a guy named Phineas Gage, who sustained a really traumatic brain injury. If you're interested in it, you can look up Phineas Gage. It's a really interesting story. But essentially, he was the first neurology patient, and he was a neurology patient by accident. He got hurt on the job, which basically lobotomized him. We didn't know what a lobotomy was back then, but now, lobes of the brain, lobotomy, we're taking a lobe out or a part of the lobe out. And, they discovered that different parts of the brain worked and controlled different functions based on Phineas's story. He got hurt. He lost a huge portion of his frontal lobe, and it changed him. And so they started going, they're like, hey, maybe the part of his brain that was injured controlled how he behaves. And it does. The frontal lobe is our primary lobe for higher executive function, and it's going to be involved in things like maintaining our personality. Your frontal lobe makes who you are, right? So if we damage the frontal lobe, or we remove part of the frontal lobe, or the frontal lobe starts to behave improperly, it can change the way that we behave and the way that we act. And we see that in a lot of patients that suffer from things like dementia, where it affects the frontal lobe or the temporal lobe. And well, it's then going to affect the things that those lobes help to control. I saw this, firsthand with my dad when he, was diagnosed with dementia. Shortly after that, probably about a year or two into his diagnosis, he started to behave differently. My dad was one of the nicest people, that anybody ever met. He was always, there to, help people out. And he treated my mom better than, any man I've ever seen treat somebody. Um, After he was diagnosed with dementia, he kind of turned into an asshole. He was disrespectful to my mom. He would curse at her. He would yell at her, and he'd flip her off all the time. And I had to keep reminding my mom that, hey, this is part of the progression of the disease. It's affecting that part of his brain that allows him to behave a certain way, and he's not going to be the same man he was. And this is a big problem for a lot of people that are caregivers for patients that do suffer from dementia, because what ends up happening is they end up getting frustrated because they feel like they're being attacked by this person who is their partner or whatever, and that they're doing it on purpose. And you have to remind them, and they have to be aware that it's not happening on purpose, and they're not choosing to do it. It's that their brain is basically rewiring itself, and the part of the brain that's rewiring itself is the part that expresses those types of things. My dad started to develop problems with problem solving. You couldn't give him a puzzle that he could put together. He used to build stuff all the time. He was into carpentry. I mean, he built all kinds of stuff around the house. We'd buy him simple little, like, 7-piece birdhouses from Amazon that he couldn't put together 7 pieces of wood. And so, it was something you really could see. And again, it all came from this mapping idea from the injury sustained to this guy named Phineas Gage. So, um, the frontal lobe is going to be separated from the parietal lobes. Let me go back a couple here. My computer's running a little slow. It's going to be separated from the parietal lobe by a deep fold right here, deep depression called the central sulcus. Just on the front side of the central sulcus, we have this ridge of brain matter. Okay, all of the ridges are referred to as gyri. Okay, singularly would be a gyrus. All the depressions are called sulci. All right, singularly would be a sulcus. So this particular sulcus is the central sulcus, and that separates the frontal from the parietal lobes. On either side of that, we have a prominent gyrus. This one is the precentral gyrus, pre because it's in front of. This is the post-central gyrus, post because it's behind the central sulcus. These two gyri are going to be prominent in our control of skeletal muscle function. All of our sensory information related to skeletal muscle function is going to be interpreted in the post-central gyrus. And all the motor function that we respond to based on that sensory information is going to come from the precentral gyrus. Now, with deep within the brain, we are going to have a lot of white matter. In fact, we saw that the spinal cord or the brainstem was mostly made out of white matter. We know that the cerebellum is going to contain huge amounts of white matter that we said were called the arbor vitae. We're also going to find a lot of white matter associated with the cerebrum itself, because we have to have means of communication within the cerebrum, within the hemispheres, and then between the hemispheres. So any kind of white matter tracts, which are carrying impulses between the gyri within the same hemisphere. So let's say we're in the right hemisphere and we're carrying information from gyrus, or say from the post-central gyrus to the precentral gyrus. That's going to be done through axons that are part of what we call association tracts. So association tracts are moving in this direction like this. Projection tracts are going to move up and down. Okay, so say from the thalamus and the brainstem and to the spinal cord, or vice versa, up and down. Commissural tracts are going to move from side to side. Okay, so they're crossing hemispheres. All right, so say we have the information on the right hemisphere that needs to get to the left hemisphere. That's going to be done through a commissural tract. And one of the body's main commissural tracts is going to be a structure called the corpus callosum. All right, corpus callosum. Corpus callosum was actually an answer yesterday on Jeopardy. They had a whole column on anatomy, and I got them all right, but they were all anatomy letters that start with the letter C. So if you ever watch Jeopardy and there's an anatomy column, I expect you all to get as many of them right as you possibly can. But corpus callosum was an answer, although the girl got it wrong because she mispronounced it. She said corpus callosum. She added a T in there, and so they didn't give her credit for it. So too bad for her. Y'all would have got it right, I know, because you've heard me say it, and now you would have said it correctly. But the corpus callosum is the body's largest commissural tract. This is our corpus callosum right here, all right? And it is the primary means of connecting the left and right hemispheres of the brain. But on this diagram, and this is a mid-sagittal section that had the gray matter taken off of an actual brain, you can see all of the different tracts running on this hemisphere here. Again, association tracts, you can see them. They're running, I'm trying to get my mouse to pop up. They're running front to back right here, okay? Your commissural tracts, okay, they're gonna run across side to side. Then you can see these projection tracts. They're running from deep to superficial. Again, this is how the brain is gonna communicate within itself. The gray matter is the thinking part. The white matter is the communication part. All right. But you can see how much communication has to go on, because we may have signals that need to go from the frontal lobe back to the occipital lobe. And we need to make sure that we have the proper myelination tract. This is the part of the brain that we see right now. This is the part of the brain that's most seriously affected in patients that have like multiple sclerosis or have some type of dementia. Because a lot of times the dementia and the MS definitely is related to demyelination. So we need all of these myelinated tracts. And if we don't see all those myelinated tracts, then that's going to have a negative effect on the brain's ability to communicate. And that's what it comes down to for a lot of those patients. Okay. It's the brain not working because it can't communicate with the different parts, and we can't coordinate functions like we need to. All right, so we've talked about these two different hemispheres, and we mentioned earlier about this whole right-brained, left-brained kind of concept. Even though both hemispheres really look the same, there are some differences in what's controlled or what's influenced by one part of the brain versus another part of the brain. We call this whole process hemispheric lateralization, meaning that typically we see some characteristics, okay, of behavior or some characteristics that people can express more so on one hemisphere than the other. Now, because everybody is mostly dominant on one hand or the other, some people are ambidextrous and they can write left-handed and right-handed, and then some people have absolutely no capability of doing one with their opposite hand. Like me, I am very, very right-handed. I can do very few things left-handed. I am a very left brain dominant person. Some people are very right brain dominant. Okay, so if you're left-handed, that would be you. But again, some people kind of have a fairly even distribution of their two hemispheres of the brain. So this is not set in stone. This is not to say that if you're right-handed, you can't do things that left-handed people can do, and if you're left-handed, you can't do things that right-handed people can do. But we see these characteristics distributed, oftentimes related to people's right-handed and left-handedness. So if you're right-handed and you're left hemisphere dominant, that typically the left hemisphere is going to be the part of the brain that has a better understanding of numerical issues, okay, scientific skills, written language, sign language, so visual interpretation, things like that, reasoning. So if you take like a logic class, you have inductive and deductive reasoning. If you're right-handed, those things are maybe going to come a little bit more naturally to you. It doesn't mean that if you're left-handed, you can't be good in math. It just means that right-handed people maybe have a little better understanding of that than left-handed people do. Whereas left-handed people, right brain dominant people, they're going to be have parts of the brain that are more highlighted for things like musical and artistic awareness and pattern recognition. Maybe they're better at drawing or painting. They might be better at playing guitar. They might be better at cooking because they have the ability to differentiate between smells and tastes. Now, again, that doesn't mean that right-handed people can't do those things, but it just means that a lot of left-handed people may have a better predisposition to accomplish those things than do right-handed people. Now, I found this interesting when I remember reading about this in school, and I started to really take note of left-handed and right-handedness. And I started to notice that when you watch shows on TV, okay, whether you're watching movies or TV shows, or where you can really notice it is if you watch award shows. There's a there's a small percentage of the population that's left-handed. Okay, obviously the majority of people are right-handed, and the percentage of the people of left-handed are much smaller. But within certain groups of people, we see the percentage of left-handed people jump tremendously. Actors and actresses, okay, is a category of that. Okay, let's say the percentage of left-handed people is 1-2% of the population. Within the acting community, it's maybe 10 or 15%, or maybe even higher. There's still more right-handed people, but we see a higher incidence of left-handed people in that. You'll see them using their left hand to sign autographs or hold the microphone or wearing their watch on their right hand. So we kind of see this across the board. Now, again, it doesn't mean it's set in stone, but it is pretty obvious in some people. Like I said, I am very left brain dominant, and I have zero artistic ability. I can't play any musical instruments. I can cook pretty well, but I'm also really good at science and math, and that's definitely the right-handed left brainness that I express. My son, he's a pretty good mix. He's right-handed, but he does a lot of stuff left-handed, like swing a baseball bat and things like that. And so, he has a good mix of these two things because he's kind of, moderate as far as his dominant side of his brain. All right, and that takes us to our last section, which is cranial nerves. Now, for our exam, I won't give you this diagram, but I think this diagram is a great study tool for lab. If you're in lab, you can print this out, and this will help you in the identification of the cranial nerves. It kind of gives them to you in sequence here. Okay, cranial nerve 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and the names associated with them. For our test, you're going to be responsible for naming the nerve. So if I give you the number, you got to tell me the name of the nerve. Or if I give you the name of the nerve, you might tell me the number of the nerve. But you're also responsible for the functions of those nerves. Okay, that's primarily where I'm going to be testing you for the cranial nerves. In lab, you have to know it all. You got to be able to identify it. But in here, you mostly need to know what that cranial nerve is going to be used for. So we're going to walk through the cranial nerves, and we're going to talk about what they each do function-wise. But before we do that, I always I love this picture here because it really paints a better picture. When we look at a diagram like this, it just looks like the cranial nerves are going from front to back. All right, they look like they're going from anterior down to posterior. When we look at a picture like this, we can see that they're not moving anterior to posterior, but they're actually moving superior to inferior. All right. And this to me is one of my most favorite images in all of the PowerPoints that we've looked at, because this is an actual human head. All right. This is a cadaver head that somebody has sectioned and then cut out here and then dissected out meticulously all of the cranial nerves as they come off of the brainstem and the inferior part of the brain. There's your cerebellum. Here's the pons. Okay. Here would be the diencephalon. You can see the cerebrum up here. You can see all the white matter deep into the cerebrum. It's just an awesome view because we don't get to see actual human brain very often. But it's a really, really great picture. So let's go through our cranial nerves. Cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve, and that's the nerve we use for a sense of smell. The olfactory nerve is going to have an olfactory bulb, which is actually going to sit on the cribriform plate. So this goes all the way back to the skeletal system lab. So in lab, you would have learned where the crista galli was, and you would have learned about the cribriform plate as part of the ethmoid bone. And the cribriform plate had all these tiny little holes in it that we call olfactory foramen. Well, those olfactory foramen are for axons to come off of the olfactory bulb, penetrate down through the olfactory foramen in the cribriform plate, and embed themselves in the epithelial lining of the nasal mucosa. Okay, with these little dendrites coming down to the surface, so that as we breathe air in, it travels across and the chemicals are going to interact with those dendrites, which are going to fire off signals to the olfactory bulb, which is going to carry back then to the hypothalamus for interpretation. And that's how smell is going to work. Okay, but that gives you an idea of why the skeletal structure is the way that it is in that part of the skull. Cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve. This is the nerve we use for a sense of vision. That's it, just vision. It doesn't have anything to do else with the eye. It doesn't have anything to do with movement of the eye or control of the eye. This is strictly interpretation of the things that enter into the eye that our rods and cones are interpreting for sight. Now, the cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, is the only cranial nerve which is actually going to cross over. Sensory input from the brain is going to stay on the same side of the body. Sensory input from the body crosses over, but sensory input in the brain stays on the same side. So smell that you have that comes up the right olfactory nerve, or comes in, or hearing that comes into the right ear, is all going to be interpreted on that same side of the brain. But vision is going to be different. The sensations and the information that comes, say, from the right eyeball is going to come across and cross here at the optic chiasma and go back to the left side of the brain. And stuff from the left eye is going to come across and it's going to go back to the right side of the brain. So it's the only sensory cranial nerve that we have that's actually going to cross in the brain. Cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor nerve. Cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear nerve, and cranial nerve 6 is the adducens nerve. And these are all going to be nerves that are going to innervate some of the muscles that help to control the eye movement. There are 6 extraocular muscles. 4 of those extraocular muscles are going to be controlled by the oculomotor nerve. All right. So we have superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus, and inferior oblique. All right. They're all going to be controlled by cranial nerve 3. Cranial nerve 4, the trochlear nerve, is just going to be responsible with controlling one muscle, and that's superior oblique. Cranial nerve 6, the abducens nerve, is also responsible for only controlling one muscle, and that's cranial nerve, that's the lateral rectus muscle of the extraocular muscles. Now, what we usually say is that cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6 make the eyes do tricks. So that's a way that you can remember that those are the 3 nerves that help the eye to move in all different directions. Cranial nerve 3 is also going to supply motor to our eyelid muscles, and it's going to be the nerve responsible for pupillary constriction and dilation. It's going to cause contraction in muscles, which are going to change the shape of the iris, which then in turn is going to change the shape of the pupil. Cranial nerve 5 is the trigeminal nerve, and the trigeminal nerve is the major sensory nerve to the face. Okay, it's going to provide us sensations from the outside of the face via 3 branches. the ophthalmic branch, which is going to go around the eye, the maxillary branch, which is going to go on the upper jawbone, and the mandibular branch, which is going to go down on the lower jawbone. Okay, trigeminal, three branches. That's going to be its primary function, though, is sensory to the face. It does have some motor control. It is going to provide motor control to the masseter muscle, so it is our chewing nerve as well, but its major function is going to be sensory to the face. Cranial nerve 6 we did, that was abducens. Cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve. The facial nerve is going to be the primary nerve we use for motor to the face. So cranial nerve 5, trigeminal, sensory to the face. Cranial nerve 7, motor to the face. But it does have some sensory function in that it carries taste sensations from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Now, because these cranial nerves are bilateral, we can see cranial nerves affect just one side of the body. With cranial nerve 7, if we have some type of irritation or inflammation associated with cranial nerve 7, it can create a situation and cause a condition called Bell's palsy. Bell's palsy is a temporary paralysis to the muscles on that side of the face. It can also cause problems with salivation and taste on that side of the face because of the anterior innervation of the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. But most of the time we see it presented as kind of a drooping eyelid, the inability to smile on that half of the face. A lot of times it comes on with stress and it'll just hang around and then it'll just all of a sudden dissipate. There's no treatment for it. There's nothing you can do. It affects some people more than other people. Some people never experience it. Some people experience it all the time, but this is the cranial nerve that causes it. Cranial nerve 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. The vestibulocochlear nerve used to be called the auditory nerve. They changed it to vestibulocochlear because it has more than just hearing functions. It also has a vestibular function that is going to carry information related to balance. In lab, you are going to look at our vestibulocochlear apparatus, which is the inner ear, essentially. Cochlear portion is our hearing portion. The vestibule portion is our balance portion. And together, they are going to have nerves that merge together to form the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is going to help us hear and stay upright. Cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. This nerve is going to carry some taste sensations from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. And it's also going to be responsible for a lot of our salivary response. So swallowing is going to be one of the major functions related to cranial nerve 9. Cranial nerve 9 is also going to monitor our pressure receptors that we find in the carotid arteries. The carotid bodies are going to be where we have the highest density of pressure receptors located, and this is going to be the cranial nerve that's going to be responsible for monitoring blood pressure as it passes through the cervical region and is bringing blood up to the brain. Cranial nerve 10 is called the vagus nerve, nicknamed the wanderer, and it's going to carry a huge amount of parasympathetic motor function to and sensory function from the visceral organs of the abdominal and pelvic cavity. Okay. Any information going to those organs or coming from those organs about the condition of those organs and how they're functioning, whether it be pain or some type of malfunction, is going to do so through cranial nerve 10. So you can see how it's going to come off the brain. It winds itself down through the cervical region, and then it's going to wind itself all the way through the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic region as well. That's why we, like I said, that's why we nickname it the wanderer. Cranial nerve 11 is the spinal accessory, or sometimes you just see it listed as the accessory nerve. It is a motor nerve that is going to supply somatic motor function to trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid muscles. So that's what that nerve does. It controls these two sets of muscles. And then cranial nerve 12 is the hypoglossal nerve. This is a really large cranial nerve, probably one of the largest of the cranial nerves. And it is solely devoted to motor control over the tongue. Our tongue is probably one of the most highly innervated muscles in our body. Okay, one of the most high precision, highly innervated muscles, because we need to have such magnificent control over tongue movement. I mean, think about how much your tongue moves during the course of the day, during chewing and swallowing and talking, and you manage to do all of those things most of the time without biting your tongue. All right. I mean, sometimes we do all three of those things. Well, we can't, we can't talk and swallow at the same time, but we can chew and talk at the same time. And we manage to do those things and not injure your tongue itself. Plus, think of all of the speech patterns that we as humans have evolved to be able to project. The majority of those speech patterns come from manipulation, tiny manipulations in tongue movement. Hold your tongue and see how many words you can say properly. You're not going to be able to say very many words properly without being able to utilize your tongue to manipulate the sound. So sound is going to come, it's going to originate obviously and manipulate from our vocal folds, but our mouth, our lips, the movement of our tongue, that's all going to have a serious influence on the sounds that come out of our voice. And that's all going to be controlled by cranial nerve 12. And that ends chapter 14. Any questions on chapter 14? All right. So make sure you get your chapter 14 assignment done by tomorrow night. All right. That is when it is due. Next Tuesday, again, we'll review. Thursday's the exam. After that exam next Thursday, I will post your final exam PowerPoint review so you can get started on that. Make sure you work on your adaptive practice over the weekend a little bit. Remember, you got 3 chapters, 12, 13, and 14 that need to be completed before Thursday if you want the extra credit on that exam. So take care of those. Tie up any assignments you have outstanding that need to be done before the last day of the semester. But otherwise, y'all have a great weekend. And as soon as this recording gets done, sometimes it takes it a little while to upload to Zoom. Once it's done, though, I'll download it. I'll upload it into Canvas. I'll post y'all an announcement. But otherwise, y'all have a great weekend, and I'll see you next Tuesday.
Hey, Dr. B, I just had one question.
Yeah, what's up?
To the lesson. So I saw on Canvas that our final is for the 30th at 8 a.m. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah, no, the final day and time, that's all set by the school. There's a school final schedule, and that's when they said we were supposed to take ours, and so that's when we'll take ours.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Dr. B,
Hey, yep.
is the final optional if we're happy with our grade?
Nope.
Okay.
No, it is not optional. It's worth 25% of your final average. So they don't let us make that optional. And lab is optional if you have an A going into it. You don't have to take it, but no, lecture, everybody takes it. I mean, you cannot take it, but it's going to have a negative effect on your grade.
Right. Okay.
And I
cool.
don't think anybody's that happy with their grade.
All right.
Anything else? Yep,
No
no problem. All right. Y'all have a great weekend. I'll see you in class in person Tuesday next week.
Have a good one, y'all.
You too.